This video contains scenes of violent content, disturbing content, and high levels of gore and profanity. Viewer discretion advised.
Video games and violence go hand in hand. As you're about to see, violence in video games has been around almost just as long as video games themselves have been gracing us with their presence way back when.
But no matter how many news reports comes out about how bad video games are or how many kids want to shoot up their school because of the latest Grand Theft Auto game, gamers still find it in their hearts to mindlessly dismember hordes of generic enemies.
So let's take a look at this brand new and improved top 110 gory and violent video games.
It's Smash TV! This top-down shooter was way ahead of its time in terms of bringing blood and guts to the average video gaming consumer. Smash TV is a game show for snuff movie buffs, you know the kind, the people who enjoy movies like Saw and Hostel. Yeah, it's up to you to dismember your way through the hordes of randomly generated enemies. Body parts fly everywhere, and after a while it's hard to figure out whose limb is whose. Mr. Shrapnel, a reoccurring character, would voluntarily explode, showering you with debris. If you accidentally stepped on a landmine, oh boy, jumbles of arms and legs would launch up at the screen. For its time, Smash TV was a beautiful display of violence, gore, and dismemberment, but sadly, not many people can enjoy it anymore.
Chiller. Chiller is a shooting gallery game that lets players mutilate tortured people in a dungeon and awards them points for doing so for absolutely no reason. There isn't a story at all in the game, other than why there are naked middle-aged white people having their heads squashed in apple presses. You just have to accept it. The game is generally considered quite gory, perhaps not by Mortal Kombat standards, but certainly for its time. The player is supposed to shoot apart people's body parts, exposing bones and blood and resulting in a realistic sounding shrieks of horror. Various special situations are created as well. For example, shooting the edge of torture racks to pull human targets apart into two pieces, or shooting the handle of a guillotine in order to drop the blade across someone's neck.
Damage, the sadistic butchering of humanity. Damage is an adventure game where you can roam freely in a wide urban setting, loot money and goods, and buy other equipment from the black market, as well as kill thousands of enemies, which may include homeless civilians, policemen, army troopers, organized criminals, bloodhounds, and vehicles. Although this game lacks a shock value the modern Gorefest has, this game does have a ton of pixel count gore, and that will litter the screen when you take out a group of 16 cops with a single burst of an SMG. Overall, this game is bloody, gory in every sense of the old and NES styling.
Bloodstorm. Bloodstorm's over-the-top violence has been well documented around the internet, but that doesn't change the fact that it's an excessively bloody game of its time. Combatants have the chance to dismember, disembowel, or decapitate each other at any point during a match. You can trim away limbs throughout the match and achieve a legless victory. Bloodstorm was better than its predecessor Time Killers. Kasumi Ninja. There are several misguided fighting games of the 90s, but one of them is Kasumi Ninja, an irredeemably trashy fighter that desperately attempted to cash in on Mortal Kombat's rise to fame. That means motion captured actors turn into crudely animated sprites that slowly and embarrassingly paw at each other while cartoony red glop flies around the screen. It ranks higher than others because of its absurdly blanketing blood. The life bars drip blood, the floor retains blood splatter, the fatalities sweat blood all across the screen. It's pretty much everywhere. The game's gore is sadly plagued by its low-res graphics and makes us think that it would have been better if they used a different type of graphic style. Quarantine. Quarantine was one of the few games that successfully exploited the features of Doom with its own texture map stages and vehicle combat gameplay. In Quarantine, you play the part of a taxi driver desperately trying to escape from the violent prison city of Chemo. Deliver passengers to their destinations so you can earn money to upgrade your cab and take on undercover missions in the hope that somehow you find a way out. Apart from being exceptionally violent, gamers had a blast playing this refreshing new take of a first-person shooter. The game was known as Hard Rock Cab and Death Throttle in Japan. Time Slaughter. By today's standard, it looks like some flash game some coder made, but believe it or not, Time Slaughter was released in 1996 by Bloodlust Software, where the game's premise was based around time travel. Two players fight one another, and every single time you hit the other person, a ridiculous geyser of goo flies out of their head and carpets the ground for the rest of the match. The cartoon-style graphics and bad voice acting makes the whole experience completely ridiculous, but somewhat fun. You've got to give the team credit to the fact that a tiny team program has crammed all of this nonsense into one game.
Waxworks. Waxworks is an adventure RPG where you travel back in time to stop your various ancestors from committing terrible acts of violence. Each level has its own style of play. The pyramid is based around puzzles and traps. Victorian London is all about stealth and evasion. The graveyard is the most action-packed, and the mine is almost like a pre-Resident Evil as you traverse a mine shaft full of mutant plants. Death comes swiftly and painfully in Waxworks, and this is where the game becomes very bloody, downright violent. Not to mention, it can make you feel pretty nauseous if you don't have the stomach for it. The gameplay is very much trial and error, and more often than not will lead to some extremely gruesome deaths. And back then, some of them were extremely, violently stomach-churning. Phantasmagoria. Roberta Williams, the creator of the King's Quest series, tried something new and ended up creating one of the most gory, ridiculous, violent games out there. Phantasmagoria is a point-and-click adventure that uses real actors interacting in a computer-generated environment. Like most adventure games, you gotta solve puzzles using a variety of items that you collect over the course of your journey. That's nothing new. But as the player explores the mansion, they start to see flashbacks, and this is where the game goes from creepy survival horror to offensively over-the-top snuff film. Let's just say that some of the cutscenes are definitely not for the faint of heart.
Carmageddon. The violence in Carmageddon comes from the sheer ability to run people and animals down in the most imaginatively brutal ways with a multi-purpose roadhog reminiscent of those seen in the 1975 film Death Race 2000. Ramming pedestrians into steaming piles of bloody flesh, hitting massive roadside bombs, and obliterating rival vehicles with copious amounts of unnecessary weapons and power-ups proves to be just as fun as it sounds. The game rewards players with points for hitting innocent people while racing, and there's no shortage of the red stuff flying everywhere as you careen into a crowd of pedestrians at 150 miles per hour. Carmageddon was a fun game beneath all the claret and one-ton violence, although it's likely that most players didn't even bother racing and just sought to run over as many people as possible. The game was banned in all sorts of countries, while other places forced the developers to remove the people and add robots, aliens or zombies instead.
Harvester. Supposedly, there was some controversy about this game back in the day because of the sex and gore, but it's nothing you wouldn't really see in any R-rated movie today. The gore actually looks pretty primitive by today's standards. However, there were many disgusting things about it, including one scene where there were 3 little children eating their own mother. And this scene is what got the game banned in Germany. It had a sick sense of humor and enough mystery to make you want to play through to its gruesome conclusion.
State of Emergency. The game is perhaps at its best when players are armed and taking on the game's ever-present police and gangs. There are a variety of weapons in State of Emergency, ranging from melee weapons such as knives, baseball bats, batons and bench chairs, to the firearms of pistols, AK-47s, chain guns, flamethrowers and rocket launchers. Players can also cause mindless violence and turn a crowded, rioting mall into a bloodbath.
Die by the Sword. Gore and dismemberment in Die by the Sword was truly revolutionary for its time. No other game in 1998 allowed for such a brutal display of sword combat. Not only can you lope off chunks of flesh anywhere on your enemy's body, but you could just straight up hack off all their limbs if you wanted to. Not to mention, you could continue to dismember them once they've fallen, which was pretty uncommon for a game of its time, but pretty awesome. While the graphics aren't up to that standard of Blade of Darkness, you really do have to give credit to Die by the Sword for making such a huge leap in the hack and slash genre and the video game industry as a whole.
Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. This was one of the first games that really shocked players with its brutality. Not only was it bloody, but for the manner in which you dispatched your enemies was particularly creative. For instance, you could flay the skin off someone, make them implode, melt them into a puddle of toxic slime, rip their soul off their body and play around a bit for laughs, or even drink their blood from 20 feet away. Eternal Champions. The gore art and animation is quite entertaining. Every character has some type of sharp melee weapon that is used to hack off your opponent's limbs during a battle. Every character does have one move that can decapitate your opponent in a single blow if not blocked, which can make some battles end rather quickly. The graphics and blood animations are pretty decent for a game of its time.
Conker's Bad Fur Day. Conker's Bad Fur Day is by absolutely no means a kid's game, but that doesn't mean it isn't awesome. This game is filled with intense gore and violence, sexual jokes, and adult themes and topics. Some graphic deaths are shown where blood is splattered everywhere and some detailed body parts appearing. Nothing too graphic, and is played mostly for laughs though. The people at Rare made this game, and they were also the same people who gave us Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64. Pretty damn ironic. The cool thing though is that this game was later remade for the original Xbox with a better multiplayer and more diverse story, and the game was called Conker Live and Reloaded.
Shadowrun. Despite its low review score and being a ridiculous teen rating, Shadowrun is a very detailed and highly violent gory game that many were wide-eyed about its content. The game doesn't feature limb dismemberment, but it does feature excessive amounts of blood and violence, as the main weapons here are katanas, magic spells and modern weaponry. No chunks of body part are seen, but merely enemies just ragdoll around. The game is played similar to Half-Life's Counter-Strike system, though with more advanced options.
Fairy Tail Fight. This is a 3D platformer and fighting game, with a huge amount of weapons to wield, with dozens of enemies and a high gore count. The gory combat is beautifully realized, with limbs cleaved and blood spurting all over the place. The blood stains stay there and don't disappear at all like in other games. There's a usually high amount of blood after a fight on the ground, and you can skid around in it and make footprints with. What a nice little detail, huh? However, the blood is pretty cartoonish and childlike, and the killings are funny and comedic, and not serious or nasty in any way. So, while the gore is frequent and in great quantities, it's pretty cartoon-like. But when you've bludgeoned your way through the 600th gingerbread man or psychotic lumberjack, it becomes less of a hoot. Deadpool. Battles are frantic and accompanied by screams of pain, gunfire, and large blood splatter effects. Some attacks result in beautiful dismemberment and decapitation. Body parts and blood stains can be seen all over the ground. Blood gushes and splats as Deadpool whirs through foes like an atomic-powered deli slicer, or stealthily lops off heads and arms. Deadpool himself is repeatedly broken up, ripped apart, only to reconstitute himself and jump back into the fray. Yes, this game is dark, gory, violent, and absolutely batshit wacky, but it's a blast to play.
Shadow of Rome. Released exclusively for the PlayStation 2, in Shadow of Rome your aim is to master the art of a gladiator. This overlooked action-adventure featured plenty of brutal arena battles, oversized weaponry, and a full dismemberment system. By that, we mean you could cut a guy's arm off and beat him with it. The blood and gore in the Shadow of Rome definitely doesn't disappoint. You can hack off any limbs and even slice torsos completely in half. There's over 100 special moves in the game, along with ridiculous names for them, like the Bloody Tomato, Flescius, Mortis, Maximus, and even the Sadist's Utopia.
Severance Blade of Darkness. This game allows you to chop off enemies' heads, arms and legs with big swords and other weapons. There's surprisingly an accurate sectional dismemberment, meaning you can sever all limbs in multiple areas. It also has some pretty amazing blood effects for a state. The blood can squirt, pool, and even run down walls. Your character can also receive skin damage such as deep bleeding cuts. Blade of Darkness is one of the most satisfying hack and slash games ever made. It's a great title to pick up and will undoubtedly keep you chopping away for hours. Thrill Kill. EA ultimately felt this game was too bloody and offensive to release and was not actually officially released on the PlayStation as it was originally intended, but many copies have since become available through bootleg channels. Not too long after, the full thing spread across the internet and we all realised it wasn't that great of a game in the first place. Either way, only the truly sadistic would want to track this one down and enjoy it. It involves a 4-player 3D fighting game in which some of its most unsavoury characters fight to the death. Armed with syringes, cattle prods, severed limbs, players simply beat the daylights out of one another with gross fetish or sexual manoeuvres, all as a result of too many blood splatters to count. Even though the visuals look dated and rough by today's standards, Thrill Kill's mean-spirited mutilation still contains some of the most intense images to appear on the original PlayStation.
Wu-Tang Shaolin Style. This game is based off the popular music group Wu-Tang Clan, and upon hearing this, I'm probably saying what you guys are saying. What the hell did I just see? At first look, this game reminds me of Thrill Kill and Mortal Kombat rolled up into one massive bundle. That being said, this game has plenty of gore. Upon first reaction, again, I was quite surprised and shocked with how well this gore is actually implemented into the game. For example, you can tear someone's head off with a chain attached to a blade, and you actually see the body twitch as blood spills out of the neck and torn off head. And this is all done on the PS1. Wow. You never see stuff like that anymore. That's kind of depressing. Gunman Chronicles. This game is a flawed story, but there's just so much depth for a mod based on Half-Life. Gunman Chronicles lets you change the way the guns react and use its bullets, even to the point where you can control how many shells are used in a shotgun blast. This is a really great mod, but as for suggested on Gory games, it's rather tame for our list, but there are decapitations and gore plenty. Just not that much blood.
Dead Hunt. Dead Hunt is a first-person arcade shooter game that merges the best features of arcade and first-person shooter action games with fresh ideas and new twists. An addictive 3D shooter game where you constantly develop your character by killing endless monsters and getting bonuses for staying as long as possible on fighting pits against hordes of zombies and skeletons. The gore level is quite high with decapitations, limb dismemberment as well as flesh being ripped off from certain guns. Bear in mind, the graphics are not the best, but the game was made long before the arrival of Left 4 Dead or the Call of Duty Zombies mode.
Evil Dead Fistful of Boomstick. Evil Dead is a game based on the cult movie of the same name. However, in this game they sacrifice claustrophobic log cabins with the large yet still linear city. This game features fairly mediocre graphics, but does some fairly nice gore effects. Whenever Ash shoots the Deadite, it will explode in a nice shower of blood and body parts, which does bring a large level of satisfaction. However, it's not enough to save this game from receiving average reviews at best.
Lollipop Chainsaw. Lollipop Chainsaw is a Suda51 game. If you know anything about what I just said, you know you're in for a ridiculous time. It's by no means a game that you should take seriously. With the Buffy the Vampire Slayer-esque music, shock value humor, and anorexia and breasts that show up frequently, you know it's gonna be crazy. But however, if you're interested in a zombie score attack, gory game, there may be some value for you here. All the gore in this game is pretty damn interesting, and the boss battles are extremely creative, so I suggest you give this game a look. You won't be disappointed.
Vivisector. Vivisector exhibits a rather unique gore system that allows you to literally blast the flesh off of your enemies to the point that only a skeleton remains. The blood and gore and physics are really decent and make up for the lack of limb detachment. And you aren't going to see detailed model damage as some of the other first-person shooters in this list, but you definitely get enough gore to keep you entertained throughout the whole game.
Deadless Warrior. Deadless Warrior is a game based off the TV show of the same name. It's a combat fighter game that puts you in the warlord's shoes with the minor exception that you're fighting other warlords that were not of your era. due to the fact that once you damage a limb long enough, you can cut it off and watch them frantically try and kill you before they start bleeding to death. It's a rather fun game for a good hour or so, till its more repetitive features become more apparent. Once you get bored of its lack of story or really anything else besides its gameplay, you'll find yourself sticking to Mortal Kombat or Super Street Fighter instead. Necrovision series. Dismemberment is the same for both Necrovision titles. All limbs are detachable, however there is no torso dismemberment to be seen and the limbs only sever in one spot every time. Blood effects are really decent, especially in Lost Company, as the blood textures splattering and dripping are well improved over the original game. Not to mention being able to use a melee weapon and a firearm at the same time makes for some fun gameplay.
Clive Barker's Jericho. Although Clive Barker was a legendary writer, the fact is this game is just lackluster no matter which way you cut it. Jericho is a survival horror game in the same vein as Fear. Most of the enemies are bullet sponges and overall it feels like it just takes way too long to kill them, which there's no real big slap in the face to players besides that. However, this game also features some very creepy character designs, good innovative ideas sometimes, and blood of plenty.
Half-Life series. Although an astounding game, Half-Life can be pretty violent in a realistic way. The player is pitted against humanoid and alien enemies. Gore is common, especially shown in the first Half-Life game, where the whole of Black Mesa has been destroyed and rampaged by alien species. Not to mention, in the sequel, an entire chapter of the game is devoted to fighting against zombified victims of an alien parasite in a dark and dreary small town called Ravenholm. It's a town riddled with gore in the form of corpses, blood and other things. The fast zombies are probably the most gruesome looking, as their flesh is completely withered away, just exposing bone and muscle tissue. While there's no decapitations in any of the Half-Life games, you can cut zombies in half by firing a saw blade from the gravity gun in Half-Life 2. Afro Samurai. Afro Samurai is an extremely violent game. Players will constantly dismember and disembowel enemies and will see fountains of blood shoot off in the air. Many times after a battle, the ground will be filled with hands, feet, arms and heads. The violence is then stepped up a notch when players go into focus mode. In there, the screen turns black and white and players will cut through enemies like a hot knife through warm butter. Needless to say, this game is not for the faint of heart.
Warframe. Warframe is a free-to-play and very fun gory game. Warframe's weapons are pretty destructive, turning a room flooded with enemies into a room painted with blood and covered in corpses. Bits and pieces of their limbs can be sliced or punched or shot off in combat, which rocks. Sometimes they sizzle with leftover flames on them, or crackle with excess electricity coursing through their veins in their corpse. This game has a lot of gore, but lacks anything in the blood factor. But that's okay, purely because of its gruesome abilities.
Zombie Driver. Your mission is to rescue all the city's stranded survivors of the apocalypse and take them back to the safety of the military base. This means that you'll find yourself spending all the time barreling through the city at breakneck speeds, ramming and shooting through literally tons of zombies. Whether you ram or blast zombie herds, you are rewarded with very generous amounts of limbs and other bloody chunks sharing the area. Being a super cheap title with some stolen zombie models from Left 4 Dead, you might want to give Zombie Driver a go if you're out for some casual zombie squishing action.
Firestarter. This run-and-gun shooter follows in the fine tradition of the Quake and Unreal Tournament series. Firestarter looks and feels more like a tech demo than an actual game. But when you shoot monsters, brilliant red blood gushes into the air in stylized torrents, much like sprinklers or hoses. Enemies can be exploded, showering in the vicinity, and the red stuff, and internal organs and body parts can also be found. The game itself isn't too particularly challenging, but there are better violent games out there, more like the likes of Firestarter.
Blood 2 The Chosen. Blood 2 The Chosen is a game made by gamers for gamers. The first thing you may notice is the fourth wall jokes immediately followed by shooting someone with a pistol and watching them blow up into a pile of guts and blood. This game has a massive amount of gore that's caused by so little. If actual anti-gaming activists got hold of this game, they almost might just make it actual solid point, But sadly this game is also plagued by an awful story which was common in the 90s, and repeating level designs even to the point where you play the same train level 3 times got very annoying.
Prey. Prey is an awesome, underrated, and trippy sci-fi first-person shooter that takes place on a huge spaceship orbiting Earth. This ship is teeming with biorobotic organisms and aliens who use humans as slaves and process them for meat. While wandering around the place, you'll see some pretty disturbing scenes, such as people getting processed, and large flesh-like veins, to even children getting killed. While many of the enemies you fight are aliens, you won't see much dismemberment, but the overall creepiness factor and morbid feeling of the game more than makes up for it.
BioShock series. BioShock was a massive hit with gaming critics, and for a good reason. It is a visually sumptuous, thought-provoking, and puts the player in a mind-bending world that has gone very, very wrong. The main theme of the game is that there is still remnants of a civil war going on between a good man trying to take over the city from its dictator. Gore and blood are high, with many dead people laying around and blood splattered just about everywhere. Infinite allowed players to pull off brutal executions with a skyhook, with blood splattering and spraying as they smack the enemies in their face, chest, neck or stomach. Throughout the series, many enemies will engage and fight each other, showcasing some brutal battles. Non-stop violence from beginning to end, including burning, shocking, beating and shooting, including blood and gore and graphic corpses.
Never Dead. Never Dead is an extremely violent, bloody video game. It's meant to be an over-the-top action-adventure game with a very, unique hero. A hero who can survive without a torso, arms, or legs when they are torn off from his body, obviously not by choice. Never Dead can be just so ridiculous and fun and frantic at times with somewhat bloody combat. Losing your body parts during battle and scrambling to get them back together adds some very well needed tension to this game. And though you cannot die, it can be frustrating being ripped apart by enemies faster than you can regroup, and having this repeat process formula every time can very well downgrade the immersion and feel to the game. There's also some very weird and backwards controls that are kind of reminiscent of a game that we know as Too Human.
Killing Floor. This survival horror co-op game known as Killing Floor has you racking kills by yourself or several of your closest friends for a very fun experience. This game only costs about $20 on Steam, and it's a bloody good time to have. This game actually makes our list due to the ridiculous bullet time-esque parts where you dismember the specimens by shooting off an arm or just flat out cutting their head clean off. Either way, it's a satisfying experience.
Modern Warfare 2. Modern Warfare 2 really gave some players frantic action, shocking moments, and a decent amount of violence. This game features an excessive amount of gratuitous violence, blood, and gore to the point where it's at the very least disturbing, even if it is a Call of Duty game. Most of the violence isn't particularly graphic, but it is one of the bloodiest Modern Warfare games out there. One mission, known as No Russian, had the player going as an undercover Russian terrorist. As they slaughter the civilians in an airport, the player doesn't have to pull the trigger. It's possible to simply walk along and not mow down anyone. But you have to watch your quote-unquote teammates light up the crowds of people. The mission is intense and may offend several people. However, you're given the option to skip the mission with no penalty, which is a plus.
Hotline Miami. The main objective of this game is to kill people in brutal ways. The sheer brutality of the violence you inflict upon your foes is simply horrifying. Blades slice open stomachs, sending intestines spilling across the room. While the graphics are pixelated, the various ways of killing people have a very realistic feeling to it, and features a lot of blood and gore. With the player being able to disembowel, decapitate, maim, and even shoot people, the game also allows a player to finish off knocked out enemies by repeatedly banging their heads to the floor, slitting their throats, smashing their heads open with sledgehammers, or even decapitating them with axes. The same can be said for the player themselves, who are just as fragile as the enemies. The slightest mistake, the slightest missed shot, or failed swing will usually result in your certain death.
Team Fortress 2. Team Fortress 2 is a free-to-play Steam game with an addictive and gory multiplayer class-based system, where members of a team fight each other in random online modes. Blood will spray comically when a player is shot. When a player is blown up, pieces and body parts will fly across the ground, letting blood rain down on the landscape. None of the violence is meant to be particularly unsettling. An option exists in the game to turn off blood and replace the gibs with objects like gears, springs and other garbage pieces.
Doom series. Doom brought video game violence straight up in your face into the mainstream. Constantly attacked on the news for its graphic gore and content, the game's violence still holds up to the test of time. Its designers went to careful detail to show that two-dimensional sprites can still bleed as profusely as in real life. Doom 2 showed many disturbing level design factors, with corpses and torture rooms littering the final levels of the game. Still to this day, the haunting textures and music create a sinister plot. It's easy to look at the graphics here and laugh off all the bloodshed and at the red giblets that remained after you blasted something. But let's remember that this game was considered state-of-the-art in the early 1990s. Since that time, of course, Doom as a franchise has grown. In Doom 3, there is a lack of dismemberment as you just shoot your enemies and a few splashes of blood show up until they disintegrate away. However, if you've never played any of the Doom games before, you may want to give the Doom series a try. As a personal recommendation here from your old pal Kenshin, I recommend looking up the Brutal Doom mod for the original classic Doom. It takes all the violence and gore in that game and ramps it up to an absolutely insane level, making it what it probably would have felt like back in the day. Gorehounds, be aware. It's sickly awesome.
House of the Dead series. The House of the Dead series are a raunchy, bloody, over-the-top zombie-killing gore fest that will have you coming back for more time and time again. All games in these series are rail shooters, meaning you don't even have to control your character during gameplay. All you have to do is grab your light gun or controller and shoot the crap out of the countless zombie scum. Decapitations, limb dismemberment, cool dialogue and generally lots of bloody good fun makes the House of the Dead series a must for any violent induced gamer.
Brutal Legend. This game is an awesome metal-based world, in which you command an army RTS style, while you take the reins as a hero troop on the battlefield. Brutal Legend is a very, very gory game, and even its title oozes with gore. It was well received by reviewers, but at the time, people did not find its real-time strategy elements and action-adventure to mix all that well. If you're looking forward to some gory fun and an RTS action-adventure, then I say go for it. And I recommend you buy the game anyway due to the fact that Tim Schafer worked on this and Jack Black played the main character.
Borderlands series. The series includes violence throughout as the player-controlled character fights against a variety of creature and human opponents using an array of weaponry including handguns, shotguns, assault rifles, sniper rifles, rocket launchers and grenades. Human enemies can be incinerated, electrocuted, which causes their face to melt and explode, and dissolved. They can be shot in half, their heads explode and turn into a pile of meat. Some cutscenes feature mild bloody violence. Now the gore and crude humour easily lets this game earn an M rating. The dismemberment is quite intense but nothing extreme because the game is presented in a cartoony and humorous way.
Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno follows the warrior Dante as he rips the spine out of death himself and descends his way into hell to save a love who is damned for his own sins. Along with Dante's journey, in addition to stabbing every living, moving thing he sees, this game also offers a morality system, which is just as basic as using the badass Grim Reaper staff for bad and using the cross for good. The more you use either weapon, the more power they get and the more you can kill. However, most if not all the gore comes from the Grim Reaper's blade. A fun fact about the game is the stunt EA tried to pull by hiring Christian protesters to protest its game in order to get publicity for to slander the original story and source material. Not only did this piss off mobs and Christians alike, but the gore tactics and the rumor of the secret achievement which states, if you dismember enough babies, you'll earn the Bad Nanny achievement, somehow pissed off the International Nanny Association.
Skyrim. Although the combat in Skyrim appears similar to previous games in the series, the new animation system makes it feel much more realistic. It's more fluid, brutal and violent. Some heavy weapons such as the battle axes deal bleeding damage over time, which comes in handy when fighting higher level enemies. Best of all, when the enemy is low on health, you can perform a finishing move that provides a gloriously violent attack, which can be anything to decapitations, lunges or neck breaking. Running an enemy through with a sword or burrowing an axe deep into the head will never get old. It's shocking and sickening, yes, but definitely satisfying and gets you pumped for more action.
Nanobreaker. The main weapon in Nanobreaker is known as a plasma sword. Armed with this sword, you slash through nanomachine-infected humans who have been enslaved and turned into killing machines. Slice through them as they spew out huge amounts of gore and blood. There's also no shortage of this either. Expect gallons of it to splatter onto the walls and floors. This is also partly due to the Japanese designers trying to appeal to us more Western audiences, such as myself.
Wolfenstein series. The blood in these titles has always been pretty decent for its time. Wolfenstein 3D may just have some basic blood effects, but back in 1992 this game inspired awe among gamers, and there was nothing else like it. In Return to Castle Wolfenstein, you could use grenades and other explosive devices to blast some enemies into bloody chunks, which is a great sight to behold. In the later release, the weapons feel much more realistic, and killing enemies with 1 or 2 shots is greatly satisfying. It is usually followed by some gruesome bodily dismemberment. You can blow off heads and limbs with guns, axes, and grenades, which results in a waterspout of blood coming out. Later in the game, you can even get some sci-fi weapons and power upgrades that can either vaporize people or shock them to death with electricity. Sometimes you can briefly see their bones before they die. When it comes down to it though, the gore in the Wolfenstein series is pretty average. There are other games on this list that most definitely can top it, but its historic relevance is why it takes its place here.
Resistance series. Gore factor has been pretty decent across all games. You can pick out different organs and limbs from the blown up enemies and allies. The gestational sounds of the creatures are truly unnatural and even unnerving to hear. However, what you find is that the loud noise associated to the explosion of these beasts in the slimy shower of blood and gore is yet more disturbing, but immensely satisfying. High caliber weapons can also dismember enemies, causing one's head, legs or arms to be blown off in a spray of gore and leaving a leaking, bleeding wound on the corpse. Mutator weapon causes enemies to convulse and mutate into massive pulsing masses of green flesh and pus that will eventually explode into green and yellow globs of flesh. Blood will spray and stain floors, walls and ceilings when enemies are shot and remain there for an extended period of time. Grand Theft Auto series. As the highest profile series on this list, Grand Theft Auto games have become the poster children for violent video games. One must consider the entire franchise since there have been more than half a dozen Grand Theft Auto games in the past 10 years. What makes these games so offensive is the freedom players are granted to do whatever they want in a setting that mirrors real life. The move to 3D is when things became most violent, allowing the beatdown of anyone walking the streets, random gun downs of civilians, gang members and police officers, vehicular manslaughter and the titular offence of Grand Theft Auto. The only dismemberment was from San Andreas and Vice City, where players could hack civilians with katanas or shotgun bursts to head, causing fountains of red stuff to fly around. Since then though, the gore has somewhat been altered with Grand Theft Auto 4, but adjusted a bit more slightly in Grand Theft Auto 5.
LA Noire. LA Noire is a gritty crime game that has you running around a sandbox-like environment set in 1940s LA. The world you're in itself feels violent, with the racism, anti-Semitism, and man-on-girl violence, which can get pretty bad. This game is not for younger audiences. Murders including shootouts, stabbings, and hit-and-run cases are prevalent. In shootouts, blood sprays from the victim and are sometimes spraying onto the walls behind them. Almost all victims of gunplay are bad guys that are shooting back at you, but in a few sad cases, it's hostages. But what puts it on this list is how murder cases are based on real-world cases that happened during the time, solving with what they had at the time. This means that you get on there, looking at every gory detail of the body as you look for clues to find the culprit of the malevolent deed.
Max Payne 3. It is said that the most dangerous thing in the world is a man with nothing to lose. And Max Payne 3 embodies that concept. It's gory, bloody, and outright brutal. The violence is depicted in a very realistic and gory fashion. Enemies will grab their neck when they're shot there. Bullets cause visible wounds to all bodies, and blood splatters in a believable way on walls. Sometimes when you kill the final enemy in an encounter, the camera fixates on the enemy that you just killed, and the game goes into a nice, slow motion. These slow motion ends to finish your opponent allow you to keep pulling the trigger after the final bullet has been fired, and results in a brutal and gory death. Shoot a guy in the face and a fleshy hole will open up and spray blood even after he's collapsed. I mean, who can forget the old franchise that popularized bullet time fun that fans have all grown to love? This is definitely one to check out for brutality and fun.
Condemned 2. Condemned 2 is fit to bursting with violence and gore. Perhaps it's the first person viewpoint or the desolate state of the city, but the violence throughout the game is rather shocking. In truth, you'll probably be more shocked by the extreme gore and brutality than you did in the first game. Different kinds of weapons can be used, such as pipes, crowbars, shovels, sledgehammers, fire axes, planks of wood, glass bottles and bricks, just to name a few. The perspective allows you to experience each kill more close up and graphically, and the next gen graphics help make sure every pool of blood and gore particle is detailed and clear as possible. There are scenes where you walk through torture chambers and scenes when you're looking into the blood-filled faces of individuals with metal jammed through their eyes, mouth and cheeks. The way players could finish off opponents with environment kills and the sheer madness of different combos makes Condemned 2 a sole reason why it's on this list.
Resident Evil, the series. You can find full limb dismemberment in most Resident Evil games, however, it's just hard and difficult to achieve, and most enemies can only have their head blown off. Players must stab, execute, shoot, and bomb their way through the hundreds of realistic-looking humans, zombies, and monsters. While not a hugely gory game with some of the other games on this list, Resident Evil still holds itself up as a violent game with blood splatters and decapitations. Basic zombies can have their flesh cut and shot off with guns, resulting in their ribcage, spine, and other various parts being shown. Stabbed with a knife, a player can stomp on their heads, and some other player death scenes can be very gory. Players can be eaten in gruesome manners as well, squashed, stomped, and cut with a chainsaw in one unfortunate case.
Silent Hill series. When Konami released it in 1999, no one had seen anything quite like Silent Hill. A creepy survival shooter, it took horror movie style visuals to a new level, complete with cutscenes that included disemboweled and crucified bodies. The Silent Hill series is storied with an insanely sick and twisted Lovecraftian nightmare monsters. Psychological horror is the realm of Silent Hill, but that doesn't mean that bit of gore doesn't creep its way in. Silent Hill might be made to mess with your head, but it's gory enough to turn your stomach. Monsters are blood-soaked and spurt copious quantities of blood when attacked, and the same goes for the player. Several environments include desiccated corpses and gory images.
Happy Wheels. Happy Wheels is a bloody physics-based vehicle game. The entire objective is to avoid death and reach the finish line. This is harder than it seems, as all the stages contain a series of boundaries, obstructions, and competitors. If players aren't careful, they can find themselves being blown into 1,000 bits and being forced to restart the level. Body parts are ripped off, heads are crushed, intestines spray everywhere, and blood just gets all over the damn place. This game is the ideal form of entertainment for any player looking to have a great laugh. It's also worth noting that you can customize and design your own levels, filling them with even more sadistic obstacles and traps.
Demonophobia.
Demonphobia is a pretty obscure, gratuitously gory Japanese survival game. It's also styled out the workings of Clock Tower. It's also beaten me so hard that I've cried on several occasions. You play a teenage girl called Sakura Kunikai, who tried to summon a demon only to be sent to hell herself. Hell is full of death traps and demons that only desire to cause grievous bodily harm to this poor 14-year-old girl. In fact, the death scenes in this game play the most pivotal role out of anything else. After seeing her die for the 20 millionth time, you want to keep her alive. This game features lots of death traps with long elaborate cutscenes that come suddenly just by taking a single wrong turn.
Rage. The gore in Rage is not quite at the level you expect from this type of game. All limbs are severable, but only in one area, and torsos cannot be severed at all. Blasting off heads is about the most rewarding aspect of the gore, as you can see brains and skull fragments flying around. Dismemberment is possible after an enemy has fallen, but it's by no means an easy task. Blood and skin damage look pretty good, but blood doesn't collect on the ground or other surfaces when compared to the massive amount that spews from your victim. Stubbs the Zombie. It must be said that Stubbs the Zombie contains a high level of gore. You can tear off arms and bludgeon people with them, rip their skulls and spew brain matter all over the place and knock off limbs. It's all very satisfying to watch and a guilty pleasure too. Basically, the aim of the game is simple. Try and infect as many of the population by chewing on them, turning them to zombies, until you build up a huge zombie army to take over the city. Rise of Nightmares. The blood and gore in Rise of Nightmares is definitely nothing to scoff at. There are full limb dismemberment and torsos can be severed. There's no shortage of blood as it splatters in high doses, but for some reason doesn't seem to accumulate on the ground or other objects. Finding keys in the game will most likely take you in nasty places such as the bottom of a blood-filled toilet or lodged in the chest cavity of a corpse. The game is not only played from a first-person perspective, but you're controlling it all using your hand and body movements, so it creates a more visceral feeling that you're actually doing the violence.
Time Shift. Time Shift is a game that spent over half a decade in development to produce a fairly decent first-person shooter. On the gore scale, this game racks up pretty high, but in terms of fun, perhaps not the most enjoyable thing. Seeing how badly you can mess up your enemies if you stop time and unload a bullet hell of grenades, missiles, and bullets will not only cause blood to splatter on your screen, but the victims will be ripped to shreds. After walking past the scene of the crime, expect to see arms, limbs, torsos scattered about the place. The blood effects are sharp and vibrant, and the gory detail behind every kill makes you want to go out and punish those AIs for being just awful.
Outlast. Most horror games of the day are often criticised for their focus on action. Outlast was released in an attempt to return horror games to what they should be, scary. This game contains lots of violence and disturbing moments. Several of the most horrific instances include the twisted and distorted faces of the patients, the blood-soaked corpses of security guards and other victims, and probably the most gruesome of all being when the insane Dr. Traeger appears.
X-Men Origins Wolverine. This is a game that revels in gore, with decapitations, eviscerations, and mutilations drenching the screen in blood. Wolverine's various flashy fighting moves are an absolute joy to behold. The angry mutant can stab an opponent in the side of the head with one set of claws before decapitating them with the other. It's certainly the most blood-soaked superhero game in years, and one that the younger Wolverine fans should probably avoid. However, adult fans of the character will probably find this game a guilty pleasure, in turns laughing and wincing at the blood-soaked display in front of them.
Painkiller series. Painkiller is one of those franchises that people either love or they hate. It's full of blood, gore and exploding body parts, but outside of that basic primal entertainment of eviscerating your enemies, there isn't much else to be had in the experience. A good, solid hit causes a typical foe to burst into steaming bloody chunks, then float around like pieces from a ragdoll. The soundtrack consists mostly of rock tracks, which is to be expected from such a gory and bloody game. You almost feel an urge to kill demons when you hear the music.
Singularity. Another great underrated sci-fi gem is Singularity. In this game, all limbs and heads can be severed, however strangely not on all of the enemies. Torso separations also only happens with certain enemies, usually only when using the blast mode. But there's some fairly accurate texture damage on all the enemies, but it's not as detailed, and the severed limbs also don't have that much gory detail as there is. But blood splatter and appearance is pretty realistic, but a little exaggerated. But that's alright, because who doesn't love more blood and gore? Singularity definitely offers some nice limb-slinging, head-popping, blood-splashing action. However, there's a lot of other FPS games out there that offer much more detail in the gore department.
The Punisher. This game, while significantly better than its movie counterpart, retells the adventures of Marvel Comics' merciless anti-hero with no supernatural powers, merely the pinnacle of human ability and a wide arsenal of firearms. The Punisher uses whatever he can to threaten crooks with a gruesome death if they don't cough up information. Throughout the levels, in addition to blasting criminals and standard shooting mechanics and slicing them to pieces in a rage mode, players could activate brutal interrogations or messy signature deaths at key locations in each stage. Some of these were so gruesome, like sawing an opponent in half, drilling an enemy in the eye, slamming a window shut in the head, or feeding someone to live piranhas, that the original gameplay had to be filtered in black and white. Blood Rain 2. Most of the game is spent slicing, dicing and shooting the tar out of countless thugs, zombies and vampires. Blood can squirt, splatter and pour onto virtually any surface. The dismemberment of the characters' bodies is also excellent and has many points of sectional damage continuing even after enemies have fallen. You can hack and shoot off practically any part of your enemy's body. Despite any little gameplay gripes, the Blood Rain series is definitely one that you do not want to miss.
No More Heroes series. Travis Touchdown is your stereotypical otaku who bought a beam katana off the internet and then is left penniless. After accepting jobs as an assassin, Travis hunts down mobs and contracts for cash. No More Heroes has some of the best over-the-top hacking and slashing fun with many executions and savage finishers. Every enemy that you encounter is destined to end up as a blood fountain, shooting geysers of red gravy up into the air. The over-the-top violence includes the ability to use the Wii Remote to quite literally dismember enemies, slice them in half, behead or disembowel them, and so on. Blood is literally everywhere, as red becomes the prominent color in this game. However, the game is actually quite funny and stylish despite the grim subject matter, a la Suda 51.
The Suffering. Death comes in very creative fashions in this game. Some guys die by lacerations of metal blades done by none other than a crazy psychotic doctor who only appears in TV screens which are recorded from prison camera systems. And some guys die from getting a large sword jammed out the top of their skull all the way down to their gut. Basically, our main protagonist Torque must escape from his hell's prison by any means necessary. The violence is stepped up every level, and the longer the game is played, the bigger the body count the player encounters.
Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a total change-up from the stealth-oriented gameplay of Metal Gear Solid. The player takes the role of Raiden, enhanced by the insane powers of a cyborg body, which grants him the ability to basically become the ninja master of the battlefield. Sure, Raiden has some brutal sword abilities and combos and Zendatsu attacks, but the shining piece of Raiden's arsenal is his blade mode ability. It allows the player to slow down time to a crawl, and from there they can select the height and angle of their strike, as well as its speed, depending on how fast they move the stick. Not only can you choose how you'd like to brutalize your enemies, you're actively encouraged to do so, as slashing through the red hitboxes that are displayed on enemies whilst in blade mode will allow you to reach into their mutilated bodies, rip their cybernetic spines, and clean out, and use them to recharge your energy. The possibilities for insane brutality, gore, and full-on dismemberment are endless in Revengeance. Not only that, but all of it looks insanely cool. There'll be enough blood and gore and body parts strewn about by the end of the game to make any gorehound proud.
Chivalry. Chivalry is an online multiplayer game that's incredibly visceral and gory. Limbs being severed is one of the most common things you'll see in this game, and the sound design totally acquaints the game's bloody themes. Whether it's the crushing impact of a warhammer, the war cry of a soldier, or the gurgling blood of a dying man, the sound in this game does wonders for giving the game a sense of impact. Chivalry also has some of the most devastating finishing moves, creating some truly gory moments, with the ability to hack off limbs and heads with feral force, which makes this game more blood splattering than some of the others on this list. In many respects, this game is similar to one of my favorite games of all time, War of the Roses, but in the end, it comes down which combat you liked better. A very, very complex one, or a very, very arcadey one that's reminiscent of Mount & Blade.
Conan exhibits some awesome gore physics with plenty of limbs to be severed. Torsos are severable as well, and they leave dangling intestines. Blood looks great, and it splatters on any surface. There's also some excellent slow motion attacks that present the best gore in the whole game. Conan can also duel up on many of the weapons to even further kick up the rate of limb splattering goodness. Conan does provide quite an enjoyable and gory experience, and the limb hacking action never gets old. However, there are several games like this that can dish out higher levels of gore detail and better visuals, should you want to try something else. Duke Nukem series. The majority of gameplay involves destroying aliens in frantic gun and laser battles. Attacking aliens will result in a rather large amount of humanoid blood that stains the surrounding environment. Oftentimes, aliens will have their limbs dismembered, which results in a significant amount of blood and gore splattering everywhere. If the player manages to injure an alien without killing them, the alien will fall on its knees, and at this point, Duke can execute them by kicking or punching or just straight up beating them to death. Most of the levels are littered with the corpses of the many unfortunate citizens who have been dismembered either by industrial equipment or by the violent alien onslaught. Duke Nukem Forever is far more violent out of all the other Duke Nukem games, and has made the largest commotion amongst its fans, partly due to the fact that it took more than 12 years to be developed, and after as such, it failed to impress when it was released.
Cold Winter. Blood and gore in Cold Winter is quite plentiful as well as dynamic, utilizing the very solid Karma physics engine. All limbs can be shot off, you can blast off pretty much any part of your enemy's arms or legs, and even down to the hands and feet. Dismemberment is quite similar to the Call of Duty series, not as detailed, but actually has some more points of separation. Blood effects are pretty realistic, as blood could splatter onto any surface and looks pretty excellent. Unfortunately, there isn't any torso dismemberment, but the superb limb dismemberment more than makes up for it.
Rise of the Triads. Explosions are very gory and fun in this game. I mean, like, when you take a bazooka and blast away an enemy, you literally get a shower of blood, gore, and miscellaneous body parts, which can include bloody skulls, rib cages, legs, eyeballs, and even the occasional severed arm. Rise of Triads is still, by far, one of the goriest first-person shooters of its time, and enough to keep you entertained and energized throughout the gory game and or experience. Saw. If you're a squeamish sort, it's best to stay far away from this game. But, then again, if you're familiar with the popular franchise, the Saw series, which this horror adventure game is based on, you probably already knew that. You'll witness and cause a number of gruesome and blood-splattering deaths as you wake your way through the elaborate puzzles that murderous maniacs often spend a large amount of concocting. While this game has mostly negative reviews due to sluggish combat and overall lack of progressive gameplay, Saw still holds true to its violence factor and gory gameplay. And I salute you, Jigsaw, for making my favorite franchise. The movies, not the games. Hell, fuck it.
Kingpin Life for Crime. Kingpin Life for Crime stirred up more than its fair share of controversy upon its release. Chances are you probably never even heard or played of this game before. Kingpin Life for Crime. Kingpin Life for Crime stirred up more than its fair share of controversy upon its release. Chances are you probably never even heard or played of this game before. That's because most major retailers refuse to stock it due to its excessive profanity and intense violence. It's one of the few titles of its time that actually had full dismemberment of characters. Blood effects look decent and can be splattered onto most surfaces. Explosive weapons are particularly entertaining as they blast opponents into a shower of meaty chunks and blood raining about. Enemies can also receive skin damage and can be dismembered after death, which is always a plus. There are plenty of titles that can top Kingpin, however few can touch it back in its day.
Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. Renowned for its gore, the game featured some of the most intricate death sequences ever in a first-person shooter. The blood and gore must have been focused on a lot in the development of Turok 2. Use a weapon like a talon or warblade for instance, and blood will squirt all over the place as you hack up your enemy. You can blow bits of dinosaurs like arms, legs and heads and watch as blood sprays all over the place. Or aim it to the middle of the body and blow them into 1,000 bloody pieces. The most goriest weapon by far is a cerebral brawl. Once it's locked onto the brain of an enemy and it's fired, it will attach itself to the enemy's head and then proceed to suck out their brains and squirt them all over in a fountain of blood and grey matter onto the ground. After that's done, the ball will then burrow into the victim's head and explode, leaving the lifeless body to collapse and hit the ground. It doesn't get any better than that.
Unreal Series. Unreal Tournament started off as a DLC for Digital Extreme's first game, Unreal, and was made to let players have a real lifelike experience with the bots. But as the dev team worked on it, they felt it was amazing enough on its own and deserved more time. That's how we get the Unreal Tournament we know today. This game makes our list due to the gory ways you can kill the other players, with the flesh blowing up and all the explosions, and all that fun stuff. Like other items on this list, but what sets this apart is this may be one of the more gory of the first-person shooters around. It's highly recommended.
Dishonored. Alright, one of my favorite games. In Dishonored, the player takes the role of Corvo Attano, a supernatural assassin fighting to clear his name in the sci-fi Victorian streets of Dunwall City. The player is actually not required to kill anyone to complete the game, and as implausible as it sounds, the game actually encourages players to take the non-lethal path to complete the game without killing their targets, and that's pretty lame. Seeing as if you choose the violent route like I do, you have the opportunity to slash, stab, or shoot enemies with pistols and swords and crossbows, which causes blood to splatter on the environment and screen in an absolutely beautiful fashion. Limbs can be cut off and thrown at other nearby enemies, which, come on, who wouldn't love that? Whenever an explosive is used, it sends bits of shrapnel around, which instantly kills enemies and causes some blood, splatter, or gore. The violence level will spike when the player uses certain powers to kill their targets, and if the player is lucky, they can also execute their targets with a delicious, up-close, and violent sword finisher. This usually will result in some graphic decapitation, which is just sweet. One of the most disturbing actions the player can take, and definitely one of the most awesome to watch, is to summon a swarm of rats to consume enemies. Then the rats will start to eat through the flesh, followed by the muscle tissue, and finally the bone of the enemy, until they're ultimately no more. Dishonored makes you feel like a badass, and you can't help but just love the carnage.
Mad World. This game means serious business on the violence factor. The main character has some incredible executions at his disposal. Maybe the blood splatter on a black and white backdrop really highlights the ferociousness and gratitude violence. Sure, the blood and gore is far from realistic, but few games offer this much in terms of blood. If you have a Wii, then it's well worth trying this one out. Bashing and slashing away through things doesn't get old. On the other hand, if you're looking for something a little similar but far easier on the eyes, you may want to try your luck on some of the others offered on this list.
Shell Shock 2: Blood Trails. For such an extremely unfinished and repetitive game, Shell Shock 2: Blood Trails manages to capture gamers with its highly graphic violence. While the graphics aren't quite up there with the likes of the other next-gen games, they do their part well in this Vietnam-style game setting. Shell Shock 2 allows you to dismember fallen enemies and cut off their heads. The gore levels are high, with stacks of mangled bodies and torn-off limbs littered around. Shell Shock 2 does offer some melee weapons, such as a machete, but it's pretty pathetic, as you can never sever limbs or even cause skin damage. The best feeling of gore is definitely achieved by the splattering heads in Shell Shock 2, but the limited dismemberment creates a barrier on the fun level.
Aliens vs Predator. Most tie-in games like to keep things as tame as possible so as not to tarnish the franchise, but Alien vs Predator is the ridiculous bloody exception that proves the rule. In a rare turn of events, the AVP game is considerably more violent than the film series is based on. The Predator gameplay is particularly gory, allowing you to rip the head off an unsuspecting Marine's spine and he is still dangling from the bloody mess where his neck used to be. On top of that, you can even melt a man's face off by spinning on him as an alien. Such gory depictions of violence are certainly a sight for sore eyes.
Bulletstorm. Bulletstorm features an exceedingly high amount of violence, blood and gore. Players are encouraged to use a variety of dangerous objects in the world to dispatch enemies, including huge spiked cactuses, patches of debris and shards of spikes and iron of which to impale enemies on, cliffs to kick enemies off, chunks of building to drop enemies on, explosive barrels and electronics to ignite and kill enemies with, and more. Players are rewarded with more points based on how brutally they dispatch a target through skill shots or by using unique methods of murder. Dismemberment is plentiful and all limbs and torsos can be severed. There's plenty of blood splattering, but it's not incredibly realistic in appearance. Bodies can be dismembered after death, which contributes to the abundance of flying limbs, especially around explosions, which are very frequent. The only downside of this game is the online code EA loves to push onto us, but besides that, the game is buckets of fun and a pool of dismembered organs.
Ninja Gaiden series. The melee style combat is highlighted by sword slashes, slow motion effects, and blood splashes that stain the surrounding environment. Some attacks even result in decapitation or dismemberment, and additional violence occurs in the cutscenes too. The swords in this game actually cut, and they cut deep. Arms and legs have a couple of points of separation and the blood looks awesome. You sadly won't be seeing any internal organs like that found in some of the other games on this list, but just being able to litter the area with dozens of blood-splurting limbs everywhere, that certainly makes up for it. Unfortunately, Ninja Gaiden 3 took a step back from the ultra-gore style by removing dismemberment entirely and making the game somewhat less violent than its predecessors. It's a shame, but still a good game regardless.
Call of Duty World at War. Call of Duty World at War is the most explicitly violent game in the series to date. Unlike previous Call of Duty titles, there's a significant amount of gore and much more blood than usual. However, because the violence is so extreme, you are allowed to deactivate graphic content in the options menu. If the player uses more powerful weapons such as shotguns, machine guns, sniper rifles or explosives, enemies' limbs can easily be blown off with a significant amount of blood and gore involved. If a head is blown off, it is extremely graphic with lots of blood and gore splattering everywhere when the head explodes. You can light enemies on fire with a flamethrower. If this happens, they are shown screaming and thrashing around until they die. Afterwards, you can see their corpse on the ground graphically burned. It is very disturbing. Serious Sam series. Serious Sam games always had a vague story that simply existed just to set the levels up for you to kill millions of aliens. Huge landscapes presented epic battles with thousands of enemies on screen at once. The games are all about chaos, gore and cheesy action. The player is seen blowing apart hundreds upon hundreds of aliens that are hell-bent on their demise. Blood and body parts are frequent and generous in this game. Depending on the weapon used, enemies' bodies and limbs will fly in different directions and get obliterated in different ways. The funny thing with this game, despite its violence, is the fact that this game can be played with kids. By adjusting the blood colour to off, or to flower confetti, the game becomes less of a violent game and more of a family-friendly game. How that works, I don't know.
Shadow Warrior series. Violent FPS titles such as Shadow Warrior have a reputation for being gory, and they certainly earned that. In short, there's a lot of blood stains and body parts left lying around after you're done with enemies. Heads and limbs regularly get sliced off, blood splashes go everywhere, and organs slide across the floor. And sometimes you can even pick up one of those limbs or organs and use them as weapons. How fabulous is that? Most players would probably stick with using the katana, because it's over-the-top melee weapon abilities. But you'll sometimes have to begrudgingly swap to the Uzi or pistol when forced to take on some enemies at long range.
Fallout series. To begin with, players have no limitations in who or what they're allowed to attack or kill, and the game does not discriminate to whether you attack anything from a rabid dog to an innocent civilian. Also, whenever you attack something, they show very visible injury with holes being blown out, slashes being left, heads exploding or being blown clean off, and limbs being torn off. What makes this game extremely gory is its VAT system, which stands for Volts Assisted Targeting System, and is one of the most entertaining aspects of the game. Targeting enemies' critical limbs and body parts and watching them be violently and horrifically blown away with a shotgun in a fountain of red shimmering blood is an experience that for many gamers will never wear thin. Aside from that, in your adventures you will also find such pleasantries as skeletons scorched in place, rotted and skinned carcasses both animal and human, and even people that have been murdered in their beds.
Brother-in-Arms Hell's Highway. Brother-in-Arms Hell's Highway is supposed to be a realistic World War II shooter that has you playing the leading officer in a platoon to lead and command a group of AI troopers. When you shoot someone, it leaves a mild blood spray. When you shoot someone in the head, the camera will sometimes focus onto the falling corpse in slow motion, and you can see a deep, gruesome, realistic damage to the head. Several times pieces of flesh would pop out when you shoot someone. In some slow motion scenes, intestines can be seen hanging out, and sometimes eyeballs have been seen hanging from the sockets. The fact that this game is trying to be as true to World War II as possible just adds to the whole immersion factor and firmly lands this game at this spot. The Haunted Hell's Reach. Haunted Hell's Reach is a game where it pits players against an onslaught of demons set in a hellish world. Oddly, melee doesn't get good until you drop to 10 health when a rage mechanic fires up and you can turn enemies into thick red goo with a single hit. This can be very satisfying because you feel the impact of your attacks and the demon blood flies so thick and fast it covers the whole screen. While the game does have an online feature, many reviewers have listed the game as mediocre due to its somewhat difficult learning curve and design choices.
Dead Space series. The Dead Space games feature an extensive amount of violent scenes as well as depictions of blood, gore and viscera. To begin with, the creatures and monsters the players must fight are constructed from the bodies of those who have been killed by others. Dead Space forces you to completely dismantle the enemies into tiny pieces in order to stop their advances. Shooting them in the head won't do it. Take off a limb and they just grow a newer, even messed up one. Take out their legs and they just keep crawling after you. It's frightening. The blood and gore is excellent and allows for full sectional dismemberment, heads, arms, legs and even torsos. Blood effects are impressive as you'll see a lot of it spurling and splattering all over the place, sticking to any surface. Oddly enough though, it's not all the flying necromorph limbs that puts the Francis squarely into bloodbath territory. Instead it's the myriad gruesome ways that the hero Isaac Clarke can meet his ultimate end. Decapitated, ripped in half, crushed, choked, impaled, and believe me, the list just goes on from there. Dead Rising series. The story was pretty much non-existent in these games as the main fun was just killing zombies with anything. Dishes, katanas, fire axes, chainsaws, excavators, all tools and items from shops and stores could be used as a weapon. Dead Rising 2 took things further as players could combine props and items together so chainsaws could be attached to canoe paddles to wade through the sea of the undead. These games are probably some of the most goriest games out there. In fact, dismemberment is so extensive that if you could have the right weapon you could literally turn zombies into mulch. The blood looks pretty realistic and can be splattered on any surface, including yourself. Some cutscenes, especially the clown's death in the first game, are incredibly bloody, almost to the point of stomach churning. Fear series. Yes, the Fear series are gory games, hugely gory at times. Certain weapons in the game such as explosives or shotguns will cause decapitation and dismemberment, resulting in limbs and heads being blown clean off. Other attacks will result in enemies completely evaporating into a red mist, just leaving behind a skeleton. There is so much detail in these games that makes it so haunting. Players would walk past a lot of dead and decapitated bodies in the games and some are truly disgusting. Scenes of torture rooms can be seen throughout the game with blood smeared on the ground, walls or ceiling. These are often accompanied by bloody skeletons that have been cleaned of flesh. Blood and gore effects are done to perfection in these series as opposed to some of the other games on this list. Fear 3 also allowed you to rip the flesh of enemies with shotgun blasts as well as a limb dismemberment. However, it didn't compete to the gore factor of the second game. Sniper Elite V2. Sniper Elite V2 excels in glamorizing its sensational long-distance kills, all delivered via slow-motion bullet cam. Apparently inspired by the depictions of bullet wounds in 1999 movie Three Kings, Sniper Elite V2 shows your shots puncturing skin, shattering bone and rupturing organs, going one step further than Max Payne's gory bullet time. When you nail a long shot and the camera tracks your bullet, time slows down and then you're treated to an X-ray view of the damage and injury you've inflicted on your target. It's gory, over the top, but gloriously addictive. Additionally, you'll find that you'll challenge yourself to see how great your next shot can be.
Left 4 Dead series. Bottom line, this game is extremely gory. The character designs of some of the zombies are straight up grotesque, and any injuries to the zombies are accompanied by large and copious buckets of blood. When using a melee weapon in particular, the player can hack off appendages or heads, and the screen will splatter with blood for a short time. The majority of gameplay involves killing zombies in extremely violent ways, including shooting, decapitation, and straight up just setting the bitches on fire. It's actually hard to notice due to the heavily dark environments and rapid pace of gameplay, but there's actually some very detailed dismemberment here going on. If you slow down a bit and really pay attention to what happens to your enemies, you'll notice some seriously gruesome detail in the damage of their bodies. The regular US version of Left 4 Dead 2 was banned in Australia and Germany due to the excessive gore and violence, resulting in Valve having to create a heavily censored version for release in those countries.
Gears of War series. The Gears of War games gives the third-person adventurer just enough violence to keep themselves satisfied even when between a barrage of bullets. The Gears of War franchise trademark gun, the Lancer, is infamous for its chainsaw bayonet, which allows you to slice your enemies right down the middle. There's a random chance that shots to the head will cause the enemy's head to explode in a spray of blood. Likewise, the use of heavier weapons like grenades and cannons can cause an enemy to explode in a display of gore in which body parts, limbs and chunks will be blown every which way. There's also the inclusion of executions, which lets you finish off a downed opponent, giving these games a more bloodier, more skull-cracking feel than most of the other games on this list. The Riftworm of Gears of War 2 showcases some intense extreme gore, even to the point of making some players feel sick. With a gripping story, campaign and fierce multiplayer, there's no shortage of blood in these games.
The Darkness series is an extremely violent and thus extremely awesome set of games, heavily focused on killing humans and otherworldly creatures using some extremely badass supernatural abilities, including your demon arms, which can use to graphically tear apart those who stand in your way. Blood and gore can be seen throughout the game, including full body dismemberment, impaling, beheading, and you even have the chance to rip your enemy's spines out. Yeah. Entrance wounds from gunshots stay on your enemies, as well as holes in their chest when you eat their hearts. At the outset, you already feel uber powerful. You can combine any pair of one-handed firearms, plus utilize a single two-handed weapon. Using the dual snake heads of the Darkness, you can violently slash foes in horizontal and vertical fashions until they're beat to a bloody and dismembered pulp. In the second game, you can also grab objects from around the level that include pipes, right for impaling, and car doors as shields to soak up bullets, and fans that turn into blazingly fast spinning discs of death, and more. This in turn grants you essence, the equivalent of points used to purchase upgrades and up the carnage and blood factor even more. Postal series. Developer Running with Scissors wanted nothing more than to shock and appall people with its Postal franchise. Postal is utterly notorious for the reckless disregard for all human life that's depicted. Besides offering an assortment of racial stereotypes, projectile vomiting, and animal cruelty, Postal 2's chief purpose is to let the player assault, maim, and murder civilians with little consequence. This is a game in which it's not uncommon to drop-kick grenades, piss on people, or whip scythes at unsuspecting civilians if they refuse to participate in your everyday life story, which of course involves using cats as gun silencers, using cleavers as swords, sledgehammers, baseball bats, scythes, chainsaws, firearms, explosive equipment, setting shit on fire, or kicking heads of your dismembered victims around. Players can choose to complete the tasks laid out by the game, or go on a killing spree for no good reason at all. Several add-ons have been available for download too, with titles such as A Week in Paradise, Apocalypse Weekend, and Eternal Damnation. Postal 3 allows for full dismemberment, including severable arms, legs, heads, and even torsos. Several real-world incidents of violence have been attributed to the perpetrator's interest in Postal 2, which quickly brought a string of public outcry and damning statements from concerned parents. The scrutiny became so intense that several American retailers even refused to stock the game.
Prototype series. The Prototype series are exceptionally violent thanks to the protagonist's ability to grow claws, steel fists, a blade or a whip arm, and use them on all sorts of objects or people. You can slice bodies completely in two pieces, vertically, horizontally and diagonally. The remains of destroyed foes does show internal organs and bones, but they're low detailed. There is no shortage of blood and it can be splattered on most surfaces. Some of your special moves like erupting massive metallic spikes from the ground can blast apart dozens of enemies at once, showering the vicinity in dismembered debris. At any given time of running about the streets, there can easily be access to 100 more pedestrians and enemies in your presence. This means that when you decide to unleash your rage, and it doesn't take long to do that, you can litter the area in bloody body parts.
Manhunt series. As history would repeat itself, every time a controversial new video game was introduced to gamers, Manhunt and its producers ran into constant battles with game classifications, angry parents, and censorship laws that stirred a fury among critics upon its release. The Manhunt series pushed the limit of what a violent video game could do, and there's not many games that can reach that level. Both games feature an incredible breadth of ways to dispatch enemies, and while they're not the best games in the world, it's worth checking out if you want some straight up blood and gore. You will get to see a lot of decapitation and head splattering goodness that never gets old. Sadly, there's very little in the way of limb dismemberment in this series, as most of the kills involve slicing and stabbing and head and skull destruction. However, the sheer violence and blood effects more than make up for it. The sequel kept with tradition, becoming one of the few games to ever receive an AO rating from the ESRB, effectively barring it from sale at most major retailers. Rockstar eventually had to release an edited version that skated by, barely with an M rating, but that didn't stop it from being plenty violent. And actually, recently, a few years ago, Rockstar released exclusively through Direct-to-Drive the original AO version of the game for PC gamers. Definitely check it out if you think you can handle it. God of War series. One of the pioneers of its genre, the God of War games promote ruthless weapon use, stylized and gory finishing kills to enemies, and brutal cutscene. Ruthless kill attacks often trigger while fighting the larger opponents. During these attacks, you can perform maneuvers like ripping off heads, slicing off limbs, chopping torsos in half, and even pull eyeballs straight out of their sockets. However, unfortunately, the actual gore of the puny human characters is not as detailed as one would hope. The god kills are where it's at, where the most brutal kills are found, as some of these will leave you stunned by their greatness. The detailed graphics, along with the savage and highly destructive kills, lets you see the action from any view, and it really sucks you into the brutal world of God of War. Without a doubt, if you want the maximum gory carnage for the series, go grab yourself some copies of the God of War games and play them for yourself. Splatterhouse. Splatterhouse's gameplay revolves around using fighting combos, demonic powers, and gruesome weapons to kill enemies as messily as possible, filling the screen with plenty of gore. There's a point to all this excessive bloodletting beyond the mere shock factor, as blood acts as a form of XP and fills your power bar, enabling you to unlock more attacks and powers. It also lets you go berserk, with huge cutting limbs sprouting from your body, and it even lets you heal yourself. The original Splatterhouse game was pretty violent, but the new one takes this element to a whole new and much bloodier level. Hell, you can even lose your limbs and use your detached arms to beat up enemies. And if that ain't badass, then I don't know what is.
Dead Island. If there's one thing that really stands out in Dead Island, it's the violence and gore. This title is quite simply one of the bloodiest games ever. Attacks on zombies often yield a variant of blood effects with blood and gore spraying from inflicted wounds. Realistic wounds can also be seen in opening on zombies as gashes can be opened up in a zombie's flesh, as well as limbs can be chopped off using bladed weaponry. The usage of fire type weaponry such as Molotovs or propane tanks will often set enemies on fire and cause them to flame and pain while their flesh burns and chars until they're little more than a blackened husk. Players are also able to execute fallen enemies by stamping on their head and making their skull explode into gory bits. Another fact is the entire game is littered with corpses of those who have fallen to the undead, leaving a multitude of half-eaten, bloodied bodies in their wake. Strewn muscle, organs and bones such as ribs, legs and arms are clearly visible on certain characters and corpses. Soldier of Fortune series. While the Soldier of Fortune series used gore and violence as a main hook, there was actually a decent game underneath all the bloodshed. Keeping with the true 3D environment spirit, the key thing that separated Soldier of Fortune games from his other first-person cousins was the use of the Gory system, a physics-based game engine that lets you, for a lack of a better term, torture and brutalise enemies at your most sadistic desires. Aside from the standard shooting gameplay, these games became popular mainly due to the numerous ways in which you reduce your foes nothing but a pile of incredibly deformed body parts. The Soldier of Fortune games were so detailed you can shoot and cut off parts of heads, arms and legs, and even hands of characters down to the bone, even after enemies have fallen. It doesn't get much better than taking an Uzi and chipping away at a terrorist's head piece by piece or watching his brains decorate the wall. Soldier of Fortune 3, made by a completely different company, was a very gory game with decent graphics and effects, but it just didn't portray the advanced mortal damage system Soldier of Fortune 2 had, or even its original for that matter.
Mortal Kombat series. This list would be a miss if we didn't have the Mortal Kombat series on here. These games are incredibly gruesome, with very high ratings for both violence and gore, and easily falls into anyone's top 10 brutal games, so it's ideal for this position in the list right now. The uproar and backlash when this game was first released was unprecedented for the time, as players engaged in 2D combat with a variety of moves that induced blood loss, explosions, and all things gory. While it's a dastardly game designed to piss off moms everywhere, kids loved the fatality finishers, including an uppercutting your opponent only to have him land in razor-sharp spikes. Players, after defeating their opponent, are encouraged to murder them with a variety of fatalities. And the fatalities are, simply put, brutal and graphic. Opponents are literally ripped in half, decapitated, mauled, scorched to a crisp, melted with acid, impaled on spikes, forced to swallow volatile liquids, electrocuted, shot in the head, torn limb from limb, blown up, had their organs torn from their bodies, and so much more. Each scene is extremely graphic and not played down in any way at all. In one of the games, the newest one, X-ray attacks were introduced. They demonstrated the shattering and breaking of a variety of bones, including legs, arms, necks, ribs, skulls, teeth, and so much more. Wickedly violent and awesomely fun.